How do, and welcome back. I'm actually indoors today because it's been absolutely freezing the weather, so I've moved everything indoors. Today I'm reviewing Man's Brown Ale. This was first produced in 1902 and it's a bottled beer. It's only available, I believe, in bottles. And they say on the label, the original brown ale. Now, I think I mentioned in the last video that they're both right and wrong at the same time when they say the original brown ale. And today I hope to tell you why that is. Because brown ale has a long history in British brewing long before 1902. In fact, in the 1600s, the 17th century, brown ale was the preeminent style. It was the most popular style of beer. And it's called brown ale because it uses as its base malt brown malt, and that's why it's called brown ale. That's why pale ale is called pale ale, because it uses as its base malt pale malt. So brown ale was very popular in the 1600s. And back then it was a very sweet beer, hardly any hops at all, no bitterness, and it was meant to be drank really fresh, literally. From the primary fermenter, it would go into a cask and it would go out to the pubs, and the publican would be pulling pints on the same day. So it was meant to be a really fresh beer. That's why I didn't need to use any hops. Or not many hops, because it didn't need that preserving, and what preservation it needed came from the alcohol. These were usually about 6% beers. But if you go forward 100 years to the turn of the 19th century, no one's brewing brown ale anymore, completely forgotten about. So what happened? Well, three things happened. One, pale ale. So, start of the 1700s, the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people in the countrysides moved to the cities. Brown ale was a city beer. Pale ale was always considered a country beer. It's what people brewed in the homes. The lord in his manor, they would brew pale ale. But when they moved into the city, they wanted to drink pale ale. So in the late 1600s, early 1700s, a lot of breweries in the cities were set up to brew pale ale. And what you've got to remember as well, back in those days, breweries only brewed one beer. It's not like today where you've got a portfolio of different beer styles from a brewer. They just brewed one beer, a pale ale or a brown beer. So you had your brown beer brewers, you had your pale ale brewers. And people like pale ale. Even the city folk like pale ale. It was lighter, it was hoppy, it was bitter, whereas brown ale was very rich, very sweet, little hoppiness, hardly any bitterness. And so the brown ale brewers had to do something to compete. And in 1720, a brewery in the East End of London, one of the biggest breweries of the time, I forgot the name, he decided to reimagine brown ale for the 1700s, for the 18th century. And what he did is still use brown malt as the base malt, but he made it drier, he made it hoppy, and he made it bitter, and he stored it. He stored it for 6 months to make sure that all those flavours became really nice rounded flavours. And it was a real big success. So much so that other brown ale brewers started to make their own version. And it was called, different brewers had different names, brown this, brown that, but eventually they all seemed to settle on one, and that was porter. So the original porter is a brown ale, a reimagined brown ale for the 18th century. And then of course from porter we get stout porter, and from that we get stouts. So they all have their lineage going back to the original brown ales of the 1600s and before that. Also, the third reason why no one was brewing brown ale in the 18th century is because of the hydrometer. In the late 1700s, brewers can actually now measure the starting gravity of their beer, and they realised that brown malt was really inefficient in the mash tun compared to pale malt. So a lot of the porter brewers who were using brown malt changed their recipes and started to use pale malt as the base malt, and then added specialty grains to give that nice richness and sweetness and all the flavours that we associate with porter. So by the turn of the 19th century, no one was actually using brown malt anymore. It had really gone out of fashion, and so no one was brewing brown ale. Everyone had switched over to porter, stouts, and it was just a forgotten about style until the turn of the 20th century, when the Albion Brewery, again in the East End of London, the head brewer there was called Thomas Thorpe, I think, and the brewery was owned by a guy called Mann, and I think he had two other partners, I forgot their name. He decided to reinvent the brown ale for the 20th century, and so in a sense it is the original brown ale. It's a reimagined brown ale, and they were the first to do it for the 20th century. But brown ale has a long history in British brewing. But anyway, let's get this open and see what it tastes like. It's 2.8%, which I believe was the original gravity when it was first released in 1902. And I don't think they've changed the recipe from what I can gather. So let's open it and we'll see what it tastes like. I'm having to use this cumbersome thing because I've lost my other bottle openers, but not to worry. Let's get it in a glass and we'll see what it looks like. Ooh. They did eventually brew this in other ABVs, I believe, but this was the original strength of the man's brown ale. Okay, we get a nice off-white, almost tan head, and yes, it's not brown, it's actually red. It's a very deep red, which does give it a browny appearance, but you hold it up to the light and it is definitely a red beer, ruby beer. Okay, what's the aroma like? Ooh, sweet toffee, a little bit of fruitiness. I'm not smelling any hop or anything like that, and there's no dryness in the aroma. Oh, that's nice. Actually, it smells quite moreish, but sweet, toffee sweet and fruity. I should mention this beer wasn't a success when it first came out. In fact, it wasn't a success until after the First World War, because after the First World War, this was only available in bottles, don't forget, and after the First World War people tended to drink more bottled beer. Simple reason for that is because during the First World War a lot of brewers dropped the gravity of their beers, and with lower ABV you can't keep the beer as long, it doesn't stay as fresh because alcohol is a preservative, and a lot of the pub beers were a bit ropey. You couldn't guarantee if you wanted a pint from the cask that it would actually be that palatable. In fact, a lot of publicans would mix the cask beer with bottled beer just to try and mask the flavour. But basically people just started to drink more and more bottled beers, and this had always been a bottled beer, so people started to drink the man's brown ale. Became very successful in London, so much so that other brewers started to make their own version of brown ale. And of course today we've got the Newcastle Brown, and we've got the Sam Smith's Nut Brown. They all came from the 1920s. I think Newcastle Brown was first brewed in 1925. And it was all because of the popularity of this beer, the Man's Brown Ale. Okay, let's take a taste. Oh, I've probably got this cooler than it should be served, as it's been in the fridge for a few days. To say it's 2.8%, that is a really nice flavourful beer. There's a lot of flavour packed in to this 2.8% beer. It's sweet. A lot of toffee sweetness up front. There's no hop presence at all in the beer. Finishes, if I'm kind, I'd say semi-dry, but it's quite moist. There's very little, if any at all, bitterness at the back end. It really is all about the malt. There's some nice fruitiness. I gather that's going to come from the yeast. Some nice sort of like berry fruitiness in there, dried fruitiness. But for a 2.8% beer, that packs a lot of flavour, and I would even say it's medium bodied. Light to medium, but still, you know, if you was doing this as a blind taste test, you'd probably think it was a 3.5-4% beer. Well, maybe 4% is a bit pushing it a bit much, but certainly about 3.5. It hides its low ABV very well. It's actually a tasty beer. This really isn't the style that I sort of like. I like dry, bitter, hoppy beers. But this is really nice, especially this time of year, with that sweetness, the richness, the fruitiness. It's perfect winter beer, and at 2.8% you can have a few of these. It'd be a perfect midweek beer if you just wanted a beer at the weekend and you've got to go up for work in the morning. I mean, something like this would be ideal. Very flavourful. Yeah, really nice beer. The actual style, brown ale, went out of fashion again in the 1950s. Along with, like, you know, your malts and your bitters, they all started to reach the peak around about the 50s and 60s, and then started to tail off as lager started to become more popular. But this, I think, tailed off a lot faster, and certainly by the end of the 20th century, start of the 21st century, except for your Newcastle Brown, your Sam Smith's Nut Brown, and this one, I don't think there were many brewers brewing brown ale in the UK anymore. Of course, it lived on in America. The craft beer revolution, they brewed brown ale, they still do. And of course it never lost popularity in Belgium, where you've got your Old Bruin, the old Belgian brown ale, which is a slightly soury sort of beer. It still continues there, but really in the UK today, no one bothers with brown ale. And it's a shame, because actually that's quite a pleasant beer. It only cost me £1.10 in Morrison's as well. So it's cheap, cheerful, 2.8%, very quaffable. But despite that low ABV, it's got a really nice mouthfeel and a really nice, rich, sweet, toffee, fruity flavour. There is also sugary flavour in this, a sucrose flavour, like a brown sugar, which isn't out of keeping. You know, if this was the original recipe, brewers back in the day did brew with a lot of sugar. A lot of people think, there's a myths going around that, oh yeah, back in the day beers were so much better because it was all malt. No, it wasn't. From 1840, brewers in the UK could brew with sugar. Parliament passed an act and sugar was allowed in beer brewing. Before then, it wasn't allowed. I think it was something to do with the Napoleonic Wars. They weren't allowed to use sugar, but from 1840 they were, and boy did they. If you look at some really historic beer recipes, it wasn't even classed as an adjunct. It was just classed as a normal ingredient in beer. So it's not out of keeping to taste that really sucrosey, sweet sugariness in beers from that time period. And of course in 1880 you had the Free Ton Act, which meant brewers, as long as it wasn't poisonous, brewers could use anything in the mash tun, maize, rice, whatever. So it is a bit of a myth that, you know, back in the day all beers were all malt and so much better. No, as soon as they could use sugar, they used sugar, and as soon as they could use adjuncts, they did. So it's not out of keeping with the style, and if it is the original recipe from 1902 for that time period to have a sugary sweet beer. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm enjoying this beer. I don't usually enjoy sweet beers, but I quite like this one. And if you want to see more videos like this where I go into the history of the style and how it developed over time, let me know in the comments. Give me a thumbs up and let me know in the comments, because I do have a few bottles of Pilsner Urquell in the fridge, and that is a style where a lot of myth has been built up around it. Yes, for example, is the Pilsner Urquell today the same recipe as the one that they used to brew when it was first released in the early 1840s? I don't think so. But if you want to hear more about Pilsner Urquell and the history of pale lager, let me know in the comments, and when I review Pilsner Urquell I will give you the history and break some of those myths. Some are very surprising. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. It's been a pleasure, and I'll see you again in the next video. Bye bye for now.